Before I start this video, I want to go ahead and shout out to two references that made this video possible. First is Jeff Nichols, who had essentially done this exercise for our class, and I'm essentially followed a lot of the same steps and philosophy and studied his work. Here's what his bag looks like, and you'll see mine pretty much is mimicking or copying a lot of the same sort of information. But I just wanted to go through the exercise of building it myself so I could demonstrate it to the class. And the other person I want to, and before I go on to that, also big shout out to Jeff. Watch his resources if you know him in real life. Give him a big thanks for all the help he's given all for students over the years and all the resources he creates that and the excellent content he's put out there. And check out his online YouTube videos. He has some really great videos where he makes look development and professional look development very easy and approachable, but still very, very cool and very, very impressive. The other person that I need to shout out is this person who had created the original asset, the model. So this is Alexander Onishchuk on CG Trader. So it's this canvas backpack right here. So this is his backpack and the original materials. You can see he also had a really nice texturing pass on it too. But we're using this model and it's an excellent model. He also has tons of other great models that we've purchased and I've used for demos and presentations. Cool. Okay, in this video, I'm going to be going over how to approach texturing this asset. I'll walk through the main canvas material that I created and then the leather material I created. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to start with is I'm going to go ahead and start with the leather. So I'm going to come over here and what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through each chunk of information one step at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and you can see I've kind of incorporated each of these elements as essentially a separate folder group so that it was really easy for me to be able to keep things isolated and keep things easy to organize. Okay, so here are some of my references. I just opened up a couple references here. I would be a little bit more thoughtful with aiming for a very specific reference instead of trying to combine too many different pieces. But just for the purposes of this demo, I wanted to go ahead and try to capture several different details that you might encounter, and so that, it kind of covers a lot of different bases. So here's just a few I'm looking at. You can see I'm going to focus on color first. So here we can see there's a lot of different variations of color. We have this kind of orange, brown, neutral color, and then we have these areas of lighter, more saturated yellow pieces, and then these like darker, cooler areas. And some leathers will have different colors, like, you can see this one has like a dark chocolatey brown overall, and then you can see this like lighter orange color popping through. This one is not quite as violet, right? It's a little bit more towards the orange, but we still have that kind of color relationship. You have these like darker regions, and in this case, they're a lot smoother and glossier. And then you have those roughed up orange pieces that are most likely going to be due to stress and damage, which is revealing more raw leather underneath. Here we go. Here's some other ones. During this process, I'm also looking at the texture patterns I'm going to be most likely getting. For the most part, I'm going to be focusing on getting like this kind of large scale, kind of blobby pattern. And the other small details like these cracks and scratches and details can be layered up over time. So yeah, so just looking at a lot of these different references and trying to pick up something from each one of them and let it inform my piece. All right. So let's go ahead and go through that leather, and we're going to start from the very first layer. And I'm going to talk through my layers for the interest of time and making sure this isn't a super long demonstration. I'm going to be not remaking these layers, right? I'm not going to be spending too much time, but if there is a spot where I feel like I need to go into more detail, then I'll stop and try to show a little bit more of what I'm talking about. Okay, you can see there's a time skip. My video recorder crashed, but here I just went ahead and I'm for keeping my machine running a little bit faster, I went ahead and disabled the more complex other materials so it's not having to render it at the same time. So I came over to my leather and I just turned off essentially every single layer that's inside here, except for my base. So I didn't have any leather materials by default, besides a very specific one that I didn't really like. It kind of had a lot of pores in it. So I tried to find a material that I knew was similar. And so I went with raw rubber. So there's a raw rubber material that was in here. If I go down here, rubber raw. And so it kind of had the same roughness as a lot of my references that I was looking at. So let's see here. So it was kind of like a semi-glossy, semi-rough specular reflection on it. So I liked that. And also had some breakup in it. That was, just gives me some free kind of stuff to work with at the beginning. So I started that and then just set it to a color that works for my back. Next, I went ahead and I started building up my base color map. So I have this brown, and just like we were looking at in some of these, we have these like darker spots, and then we have these lighter and oranger spots, right? So I was kind of building it up in those layers. So I was getting these kind of darker spots. And in general, if I can help it, I'm not going to just be adjusting one attribute at a time, right? Like, so if I'm going to be adjusting the colors, I'm not going to just always adjust the color. I'll sometimes try to also adjust the roughness, right? So in this case, you can see I'm darkening the color, so I'm multiplying the color, but on the roughness, I'm just overriding the roughness, so it's a little bit rougher. Um, Depending on your reference, you might see that it's like a little bit glossier, so you might go the opposite direction. But I just went this way, just because it felt right. And then I went for the lighter colors. So we'll see those. So you can see those starting to come through. Oh, darker colors, lighter colors. So getting some of those lighter oranges. For the color, because I set it to overlay, it's essentially going to be adding this information down to the layer below. You can see this color is a little funky just by itself. If I set it to normal, it'd look really strange, right? But with overlay, that's a blending mode, so it's going to be affecting layers below it. So it's tinting as well as adjusting the values. So again, I just have it affecting roughness and color. In this case, these are getting glossier. Those areas where that orange is, it's slightly glossier. Okay. So the next thing I could probably go further on this, and honestly, looking back through it, I would want to maybe go through this a little bit more carefully. Let's go ahead and just double check these maps because I think I'm also skipping over some interesting information. So on this one, there's nothing really interesting to this. It's just a fill map. So I just have this grunge material that I'm blurring. So I have these nice soft shapes. But on this dark one, you can see I'm not doing just a map. I'm also doing a edge detection or smart mask. So let's go ahead and take a look at that again. So let's take a look at this in color, right? So here's all those darker values, right? So you can see they're collecting in the cavities, right? So there's like some ambient occlusion going on there, as well as just adding to the layer. So if I build this up over time, right? So here's my map that I created, or I loaded in. I just grabbed a grunge map that looked pretty good. I used a paintbrush just to add some specific variation because I couldn't find a map that gave me exactly what I wanted. I used a node like blur slope just to kind of break up the shapes, right? So I have all these like really fuzzy soft shapes, and so that kind of chunked out some things for me. And then here, I went ahead and added on a ambient occlusion. So if I take a look at this, right, that ambient occlusion map is essentially detecting edges and cast shadows and adding them to the mask. So I just found one that was in here, and I set the blend mode. If I set it to normal, you can see it looks something kind of like this. But if I set it to screen or add, linear dodge add, screen and linear dodge add are just slightly different, but they're essentially going to take the white values and add them to the layers below. So I did that. Just blurred everything just because everything, starts to look too crunchy, right? You see all those shape patterns which don't look good. So we just do that. And then I had some areas that are painting out down here. So sometimes I'll just add a paint layer and just fix some areas, but for the most part, we're not seeing that much of that effect. So that's why that map is just a little bit more complex. It's not just painted, and it's not just a fill map. Okay, so we got the lighter colors, and so the next feature I want to emphasize with this is this kind of edge lightning effect. In this case, this has a very like rounded, so it's almost like they rounded the skin around and then they stitched it. But some pieces are going to have this raw sort of look. Oh, this one has it right there. Okay, here we go. So you can see right there, we have this, the treated outside leather, and then we have this like raw edge that goes around from the cut. And so you can see if I look up just like a leather strap, you can kind of see what that looks like. On the outside, you have like the skin, and it's treated some way. I'm not an expert on this. And then you can see where it's been cut. There's that fibrous kind of look to it. And so I'm kind of going for that look. You know, you can see it here on this one as well, on this one, right? That's just a treatment I would want. There's a couple other ones, obviously, like we were looking at some other ones where it doesn't have that, right? They have a more cleaned up or refined edge. But that's just, I'm using these references. So to capture that, what I did is I created this edge color node, and so, or layer. And so in this layer, all I did is I am essentially taking the edge detection here. So you can see right here, I have this mask that I found in the smart masks that does just kind of like edge detection, and I adjusted it so I can get like a tighter edge here. I broke it up a little bit because it was too perfect, so I just multiplied on a dirt map. And then I used a warp node to just kind of get it a little bit more distorted. So you can see on areas right here, like that right there, with that warp, here we go, there we go. Warp, it kind of makes it a little bit more organic instead of just perfect, right? So warp is really nice that way. All right, and so I have this, it gets rougher. I push in the height a little bit so it shrinks a little bit. So you can see there's a bit of a height difference right there. And then just that color. Cool. All right, to make it a little bit more hairy, because I'm noticing it that it gets kind of a little bit hairy in there, I went ahead and did this edge frizz. This is what I just called it, to get those kind of like a little bit of a surface distortion and breakup on there, right? So it feels a little bit grittier, right? So if we go back and look at those references, we can tell that that surface feels kind of gritty. And if I was to do this in, you know, if I was rendering this in RenderMan or Houdini or something like that, I would probably put on a light groom, like XGen or something like that, just to get some little fuzzies that come off there to better represent that. But for the most part, I'm just kind of breaking it up a little bit so it's a little bit rougher. So I just got this kind of speckly sort of pattern on here. So I'm just using essentially the same exact, oh, that's the edge color. So I'm using the same exact mask here. And you can see I'm just using this dirt to kind of get that to be like really, really pebbly and high frequency. Okay. Next thing I did is I wanted to get some overall damages and scratches on this, just from regular wear and tear, right? You know, as things like your fingernail or keys or something that you walk past brushes it, right? It's going to scratch that top layer, and you'll see that bottom or the under layer coming through. And in a lot of cases, that's going to reveal a lighter orange color, right? As we kind of remove that top dermis layer, right? So a lot of these wear areas start to pick up that color, and stress areas. So you can see it in folds too. When it folds, it kind of cracks and then reveals like a more raw leather underneath. Cool. So I was going to get that. You'll also notice these kind of strap details, which are really cool. Oh, not that one. We'll look at that later. Right here, this one's a good one. So you can see these kind of wrinkling from the straps, just like the wrinkles on this one. It keeps folding and folding and folding here over time. And so you can see there's a lot of this stress here, which we'll get eventually. So let's go back over to Substance Painter. And let's go ahead and start with the scratches and damage. So on this one, it's a lot like essentially a lot of times I'll just duplicate layers. This is just duplicating this edge frizz layer, but instead of trying to use this kind of mask, I just went ahead and deleted those and just started putting on some texture mapping. So you can see I started with just adding in this grunge dusty scratch, right? I would want to layer this up, but again, like I'd duplicate it and add a little bit more information. And let's go ahead and do that actually. So I might duplicate that and get different scale, right? So let's go ahead and on this one, we're going to set to screen. So it's going to combine with the layer below, but let's get a different image. I wanted to get something that still kind of feels like it makes sense for the type of wear shapes I'm seeing on my references, right? I'm not going to just throw on anything, but I'm going to look for something else that kind of has this kind of scuffed, scratchy, shaved look. So I think these shavings right here are pretty good, or maybe these spots dirty. We'll take a look at them in a second. And these are just scratches. So I want to get some smaller shapes. Let's go ahead and drop this one on here. And that's overall a little bit too much, so I'm just going to go ahead and bring the value down a bit. And I'm also probably going to use my balance to kind of control how much I'm seeing. All right, so we just have that there. And then I had this paint, and I was just playing around with it, but you can see I added just some custom scuffs and shapes there. Okay, so here's what that looks like. I can get rid of those grunge shavings. And I might want to dial back the height a little bit, but on the deeper scratches it feels good, but on some of these little areas it kind of gets a little too bumpy, but it's looking fine. So now I'm going to add the stress damage. So stress damage is where I'm going to have like larger areas of damage and wear from the overall kind of like wrinkling and unwrinkling and kind of bending the surface. So if we look at that, this is what those maps look like. And I really kind of isolated these to these straps here, and the straps, actually, I guess I didn't do it on the side. I accidentally got some back there. I was just focusing on the front. So on here, what I was doing is you can see I have, so this is some other stress that I wanted to put up here because, you know, I would imagine that the corners would get folded more often. But I first started with this paint layer. So I essentially added a paint layer. Well, I'll just show you really quickly how I did this. So I went ahead and went in here. I found something that had like a hatchy shape. There's quite a few of these, but let's see if we can find one. Something like this. So I took a brush like this one. I wanted to get it kind of, linear and not so jittery like that. So the spacing is fine, but I'm going to go ahead and bring the angle jitter down a little bit. And then I'm also going to go ahead and make this, let's see, we are going to turn off the flow pressure, and we're going to turn off the, let's see, size, that's fine. I think that should be fine. Let's take a look at this. Oop, my mouse is going to die. Oh, right, I was going to rotate this. So we're going to rotate this 90 degrees so it goes this way. So this layer itself here, right, it's affecting color, roughness again, and it's pushing the height down. So if we come in here and I go ahead and paint that, you'll see that as I drop it down, it's going to create those shapes. So clearly that's like way too much and looks really disgusting. So what I was doing was I brought the flow down. So the flow is just, you know, every time I run my brush and it updates a stamp, it's going to gradually, with low opacity, build up the form. So you'll see as I kind of draw that over there, right, I can kind of get that shape going. And so I did it a bit over there, kind of did a little bit of it over here too. Right. I also added like some, a little bit down at the edges or ends, right? So in this case, I kind of let it go ahead and have follow the brush stroke direction. And then something I was also doing was I usually go ahead and now paint black, right? So we're painting white in there. So now I'm going to go ahead and paint black, right? But you'll see as I paint black with low flow, you can see it doesn't update very quickly. I found with flow, if you're using a black value, you need to use a higher flow value. And if you're using white, you use a lower flow value to kind of let it be gradual. All right, so I was just kind of, you know, dialing it back a little bit. I could be a little bit more intentional with these shapes too if I wanted to, but that gave me just really quickly kind of the look I was going for. And then I just probably used something like this where, let's go ahead and just bring this down to low flow. Let's turn off flow based on pin pressure. And I mean, I don't love doing this. This doesn't look amazing, but let's just see if we can get this to look decent. All right. Looks okay from far away. I used a different brush. I don't remember exactly what I used, but you can see here this is working pretty well. So this is what my map ended up looking. Okay, so you can see I just used pretty much the same exact map there. So yeah, so that's pretty much all I had to do there. And on this one, I just used that same concept, but without this hatchy brush. I just used a soft fuzzy brush to get very, very, very subtle kind of color right there. So it just adds a little bit of color and breakup and just wear over on those edges. Okay, add another stress layer here. And let's take a look at where this one's at. So I think I just wanted to re-emphasize those folds. So I just kind of use this again to just make those folds a little bit more intense. Okay. Then I added some larger scale wrinkling to the surface, right? So it just kind of broke up the surface a little bit and made it feel a little bit more wobbly. So without that, feels pretty smooth. And with it, come on. Oh, that's stress, my bad. So you can see just adds a little bit of wrinkle to it. And really this is just going to be, oops, I keep opening the wrong one. I'm just using the folds large texture map. So if we come over here, or creases soft, sorry. Creases soft, right? So it just has this kind of wavy pattern to it. I just played with the levels on it a little bit, and then I came over here and just gave it a positive height. That's all that one's doing. Nothing special on that one. All right, so the color was feeling pretty good. I got some good kind of detail and wear. So now I wanted to go ahead and just make this surface feel a little bit more dynamic and have my reflections respond a little bit better to kind of what's happening to the surface and add a little bit more variation. So looking at some of my references, let's see. I'm gonna look at a couple of these. So this one has a pretty good example of this, right? So we'll have these like areas here that get super dry, especially where some of those marks and scuffs are. We'll have those scuff marks, right, where it changes that specular reflection. Here we have something that's staining it or polishing it, so it gets really glossy. But then we have these scuff areas where it kind of roughens up the surface, and so it gets, the specular reflections are a lot more broken up. Here you can see the same thing right here. You can see that specular reflection getting broken up there. Let's look at a few more. We get a little bit of it here. This one's overall pretty polished, but look at how rough this area right here is compared to the area. It gets glossier, and those cracks, you can see those cracks get super rough. So I'm going to kind of incorporate some of that stuff. So the first thing I did was I added this kind of large scale roughness breakup. So you can see here, just the map kind of looks like that. And it's affecting the color too. So I was trying to get those kind of scuff marks that I was noticing. So I was setting it so that it gets rougher. Should be rougher at least. Nope. Okay. I'm making it. Yeah, I'm making it rougher. So I'm screening it, which is, this gets kind of confusing, but let's take a look at this roughness, right? So this layer right here is adding onto a linear dodge add or screen. So I'm taking this value and I'm adding a lighter value to it, which makes those areas rougher, right? And they're kind of marked kind of like scuffs that I felt like I was seeing inside of the references, right? Here's what it is just really just this one pattern right there. And I just played with the balance on it to control how much I had there. And then what I was doing was I just added just very subtly color, right? So I was just lighting the color just subtly because I felt like that really went a long way to helping emphasize those areas, just super subtle. Okay. Then I did it again, but with a little bit more drastic. And this time I was making some glossier shapes, right? So on this one here, again, I'm doing roughness, but instead of the roughness screening, it's multiplying, which is darkening it. So if I look at this roughness, right, so it's going to darken because I'm multiplying the values below in the roughness channel. So all those areas are going to get shinier. And same thing, I just kind of found a cool texture map that kind of felt like it had the shapes I was looking for in the reference. And again, this one also was affecting color just a little bit. They're just slightly lightening the surface. So that you can see with just both those two, it makes that surface way more interesting. All right. Let's wait for those to get up. Here we go. There we go. Cool. All right, let's go ahead and turn that one on again. All right, so this ambient occlusion roughness part right here, I was noticing that in some of these areas that are protected, like down here, we're probably not going to get as much wear in there. So that means the surface is probably protected more, which means the surface is probably a lot less likely to be scuffed up and rough, right? So here's this ambient occlusion roughness. Right there, it's subtle down there, or up there, but it's more noticeable down here, ambient occlusion roughness. Right, and you can see it around the metals. So if we take a look at that, it looks something like this, right? So it's going to be the same idea as when I was doing the color information at the bottom, right? I'm just getting a cavity ambient occlusion detection node, breaking it up, right? So if I just don't like the shapes, I'll use a warp or a blur slope just to break it up. Then I didn't want it to affect the edges, right? Because the edges where we had that raw orange color, I wanted those to be, left alone. I didn't want to have this affect those too much. And then I went ahead and just used a little bit of paint to de-emphasize some areas that ambient occlusion map wanted to emphasize. And then just added some texture to it so it's not so it's constant and full. So if we show that texture, there we go. So it just breaks it up a little bit more. Cool. All right, so let's keep going. Here's our hero damage. So this is just, I wanted to make a layer where I could, if I wanted to, add a very specific mark or shape from a very specific event. So you can see this is a lot like those other damage layers where it's got color, pushes in the height, gets rougher. And on this one, I'm just dropping in a image. So you can see I put a fill layer in, and I'll just do this from scratch. So we'll add a fill. Let's close that one. Let's go ahead and find an alpha shape. So I was just looking for like a shape that I could use as like my base for like a kind of a larger scratch object shape. So let's see. All right, let me find something. Well, I might just end up using the one I used before. We'll just use this drop. So this is how I did it. So we can go ahead and drop it on there like that. That is by UVs, but if I switch it over to warp projection, and then I click on this button right here with the warp projection selected, the surface tool, I can click and drag it on the surface. And so that's going to snap it to the surface. And then I can use rotate, move, and scale to position it how I want to, right? So scale this down, go ahead and then we'll go ahead and rotate this a bit like that. Let's go ahead and move it. So I was just kind of getting into place. And if it feels like it's kind of going into the model a little bit, I'm just going to go ahead and use that surface tool again. So that warp projection is just going to snap it to the object surface. And then what I did is I went ahead and just used blur slope again to break up the shape. In this case, I used a high pass node with levels to kind of make that less solid, right? You don't have to do that, and I can play with this radius maybe to change that a bit more. But you don't have to do that, it's not a big deal. And then I, of course, broke it up more so it's a little bit more crunchy. So here we go. There's that object right there. And then I can go ahead and if I wanted to, I could just move that around on the object or the surface and just place that in a different location or draw or paint on it too, right? I could do the same thing I was doing earlier. Let's go ahead and go to paint. I'll just use something like, let's see, charcoal, right? So I can subtract and add to that shape. And that blur slope's going to really go a long way. That blur slope and levels and high pass are going to go a long way to kind of clean up that shape and make it look like the rest of my kind of mark there. But yeah, and then if I wanted to kind of soften that right there, what I could do is above this levels node, I could add a paint layer. We're going to set this to multiply, and then I can just bring this down to a low flow. So we're going to build this up pretty slowly, maybe not that low. And so I can just kind of drag over that, and you can see I can soften that edge right there on one side and let it be strong on another side. Cool. All right, so that's hero damage. All right. Then we have this top light. So this is just going to be essentially getting some like color desaturation or UV bleaching or dust collection because of surfaces that are pointing up in space. So in this case, I use this mask editor that's going to be most likely a smart mask in here that is going to have, let's see, something like this one right here. This one's going to be from top, so that's going to be position. I instead used, let's see, ambient occlusion and world space normal. So you can see on the world space normal is the most important part of this, right? The world space normal is determining which direction the surface is facing. So in this case, I want it to be top to bottom, so looking this way. But if I inverted that, it would be bottom to top. You can't see anything, but if I did right to left, right, let's go ahead and go here. Oh, that's really not doing very much. Anyways, okay, so I did that. I also have a position gradient that's used to kind of keep it from going down too far. I was just keeping it up here a little bit. Ambient occlusion and curvature to mask off shadow areas, right? So I'm just using that to kind of break it up a little bit. And then it also has a texture in it, right? So you can control how intense that texture is. The tiling on that is a little ridiculous, but let's see, tiling, texture, let's see, texture 1, and then we can just bring that scale up a little bit, maybe a little bit of contrast. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so super subtle, very low, probably also just affecting color, and I could have it affect roughness as well. And then we're almost done with just the base leather. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply adjustment. So you can see this adjustment is changing the colors, the sharpness of the details, and the contrast of my specular reflections. So this is a paint layer. It's an empty layer that has nothing in it. I just created a paint layer. I said it's the color channels I wanted effect to pass through. So roughness, color, pretty much just roughness and color, right? Just I went ahead and set them to pass through, which means that this layer can affect all the layers below it. And so the first thing I did was I used a sharpen node, right? Which is just going to kind of sharpen the details. Very, very subtle. If you go too far, it can get kind of gross, but here you can kind of see it up close. You know, these little gritty spots get a little bit grittier. Through texturing, things can get a little soft over time. Here I'm doing a color adjustment, and really this is actually to work in conjunction with this hue saturation value thing. So this hue saturation value, I wanted to drop the value, the darkness or lightness, so I just darkened it a little bit. And by doing that, I lost some saturation and color, so I just use my levels node to increase contrast. So you can see this is going to increase contrast. I'm just pushing this down a little bit. And then I was just shifting the saturation a little bit down. And then the roughness, I went ahead and again played around with those. I increased contrast, and then I made the specular values overall rougher, but then we still have this contrast. So specular values get we get some sharper shapes in our specularity. And I probably overdid it a little bit just right here, but we have that just affecting roughness, and this levels node is just affecting color. So those are both there. Cool. So that's my base leather. Next I did an embossing effect. So let's go ahead and look at that. All right, so for my embossing effect, I'm just gonna go ahead and turn that on right here. All right, so I was going for an effect similar to this, right? So what I want is I want this kind of tool cut, right? I used a tool, maybe it had heat to it, which kind of burnt or had an effect on this, but it has sharp edges. You know, it's like a sharp kind of chisel, but it's like shaped in a particular pattern like this, and you stamp it on. And so something that's a little subtle here is there's kind of like a soft pull on it, right? This still feels really, really soft, like this surface, because it's leather. It's like skin. It's like if you pushed on your skin, you know, it'd be a little bit elastic and a little bit gooey. Okay, so I have a larger kind of symbol here, or shape here, but you can see we get this kind of push-in effect. We get that hard cut. We're getting a little bit of that color change, but we also have this kind of like soft, like kind of pilling effect around it. That's kind of making the leather still look like it's soft material, right? It's really making these details feel a little too gross and crunchy. Overall, this leather is looking a little too gross. All right, but anyways, let's keep going. All right, so here is how we've approached this. So I'm going to go ahead and again, like always, build this up slowly. So the first thing I did is I made an anchor point layer. So this is going to be a layer that I'm going to be using to load in my pattern, or essentially define my pattern. I can always come back here and change it. So it's just again an empty paint layer. I just created a paint layer. It doesn't even have to be visible. I created a mask, and inside that mask, I'm going to press Alt to click on that. I loaded in a logo. So let's go ahead and you can see I made a lot of tweaks to it, and that can look really overwhelming, but in general, just keep in mind that you just start adding these things as you're like, oh, that thing's a little off. Let me just tweak this. So don't be overwhelmed by needing to know this whole procedure right here. But essentially what I did was I filled this with white and brought in the logo. The reason why I filled it in with white, because I was bringing in a image that had a white background, but you can see overall that, you know, it stops out there, which is a bit of a problem. Oh, wait, we're not going to see that example. Here we go. So you can see that, right? It's like if I didn't have that there, you can see it's pushing along these edges out here too, where that edge of that image is. So what it is, I put a fill layer there, or fill there. Then I had to go ahead and paint out those little borders. You can see I accidentally got a little bit of his tail. And so for this shape, it was something I was noticing later on, but it was a low res image, and it was getting some jagged shapes. So what I did is I did a very, very subtle blur, and then used a levels node to clamp the values back down. So I just, you can see right here, it shrank a little bit, but that way I got rid of some really sharp edges. And it is a little soft, and I kind of want to just keep it a little soft. Let's go ahead and dial that in. Because if it gets too crisp, you'll see it can get a little sharp and uncomfortable. All right, so I just flipped it, right? Because white's going to be revealing and essentially white's going to be where my logo is going to be. Let's see, I added some text just as a demonstration. Added a subtle blur over everything, so the text kind of loses a little bit of its aliasing. I don't even know if this one's doing anything. It is just very subtle. All right, so you'll see I went ahead and made an anchor point. So this is going to be referenced. You can see it's being referenced in 3 other layers, or twice in one layer and then another layer. And then I went ahead and I went ahead and blurred it and then shrank it. So this is just shrinking the surface in. And then you can see I made like a blurred anchor point. And on this linker, I'm just using this in one single file. So you don't have to know necessarily why I did that last part, but hopefully we can cover that in a second. So let's go over to logo height. So in logo height, all I'm doing is I'm pushing the surface in, right? So I'm just pushing a negative surface. You see I'm also increasing roughness, which I really kind of didn't need to do, but you know, I don't know. I needed it for some reason. So here, and that happens if you've been doing a larger project for any amount of time, you'll come back and be like, well, I don't really remember why I did that. But usually you had a purpose. All right, so in this case, what I did here was, here's my logo. I kind of wanted to grow it out and have this really soft kind of transition outside of the object, right? Because this is going to be punched in, right? So if we take a look at this, that's going to be punched in. And then this right here is going to be the soft pilling around it, right? So I need to kind of grab everything around the logo and push it down. So let's get rid of that hole punch for a second. All right, so what I went ahead and did was to get that area, I went ahead and added a fill layer, or brought in my logo. I beveled it, which kind of grew it a little bit, and then I blurred it, which is going to soften the edges. I might do this, but I left it alone for now. I kind of kept it there so I could like subtract back out. But I'm going to do that subtraction on a different layer. So punching it back in, so I just turned that off. So that bevel just kind of grows it a little bit. And there's that, and that bevel does add this kind of cool chisel edge effect, but we're not looking for that right now. So we're just going to go ahead and blur that. All right, and then I wanted the tool cutting effect, right? So we have that soft pilling, but then we also want the surface to have that cut bite in it. So what I did was I went ahead and did the same kind of concept. Instead of blurring, I just brought in that fill layer right there. And I also have like a anchor point I made here. I really didn't need that. So when we turn that on, it just punches it in, right? And this one right here is set to being used. The height isn't normally height is set to linear dodge, which means it blends in with the information below, right? It mixes with the information below it. But in this case, I set this to normal. If we look at with linear dodge, you can see linear dodge, it's like adding, or in this case, subtracting with the information below it. And you can see all the details from the surface are showing up in here too. I didn't want that. I want it to be like a stamp that flattened it and squished it, kind of like some kind of hydraulic press, you know? So I set that to normal so that it doesn't blend with the layers below. It just overrides them wherever this white map is here. And if I took that and I set that, if I played around that height, you can see I can push it up and I can push it down, so I can get some interesting results. But I kind of wanted it just to feel like it was pushed down and flattening and squishing that area down there. All right, then I added some color value. So you can see I just darkened it a little bit. I went ahead and did an edge, kind of like an edge detection, just so it kind of enhanced those edges a little bit. So this one's, again, kind of doing very much like the logo height down here, that soft one, where I just went ahead and blurred it. In this case, I warped it so it had a bit of a texture, and then I just cut that out so it was only affecting the outer edges. And then I added a little bit of this like kind of grittiness to the surface inside there. And this one's, again, very, very similar to the other ones, as I'm referencing that logo, right, with that anchor point. In this case, I'm grabbing the slightly blurred one. And the reason why I grabbed the slightly blurred one, you can see it here. Let's go ahead and turn this to logo. Let's see, logo anchor mask. Actually, it's not visible. It was visible at a different time. And I had to make that for a different reason because I think these bumps were starting to get up on the edges. So it was kind of breaking the edge in a really gross way. So I went ahead and made like a slightly shrunken version of my logo. That's what that logo anchor blur is, so that I could, get him away from that edge and kind of shrink that in. But that's generally the gist of this kind of embossing effect, right? The punch right now might be going down a little too low, so I might kind of pull that up a little bit. And you see it feels good up here, but down here kind of feels a little too much. So I could play around with that a bit by just probably going in here and let's go ahead and add a paint layer. And we can go ahead and go over here. Let's just get a basic soft brush with a low flow, turn off all pin pressure stuff, and we might just kind of darken that a little bit. So you can see we'll set this to multiply. So black, oh wait, set this to, let me look at this. Yeah, multiply. I should multiply, darken it. Okay, that's really weird. Cool. So then if I paint white in here, it's going to undo that black. So I'll just kind of just touch it up a little bit in here. Okay, so there's that. And I might just dial that back off a little bit, just by touch, but cool. And if I wanted to change the logo, I can swap out the logo for a different image, just coming in here and then going to where my logo is loaded in and just loading a different image in. I can also translate them over. So let's see, we're just going to offset it in the x-axis because it's slightly off-center. Same thing with the text. Let me just bring that off, set it a little bit here. There we go. And so yeah, just gives me all that control. So that's the embossing. And I can just like kind of duplicate this setup or make maybe a smart material out of this where we just load in the anchor point information. And then I could just load that in at any time to kind of make embossing in other places. So that's the embossment. The next step I'm going to show is how I made this sticker up here. So I got this kind of sticker that I made to make it feel like there's like a torn or old and worn sticker up top on top of the leather, and we'll go over that next. Okay, for the sticker, we're going to go ahead and do the same as we've done on all the other layers. We're going to build this up over time. So the first thing I did was, just like with the embossment, is I started with a shape, right? So I just pulled in this shape node. Again, I set this, had a black background just in case, but this is just a shape node that I, in here, you can grab shape. It's essentially a circle, and I just grabbed the up the hardness, and then just when I made sure I made an anchor point because I'm going to reference it. I also made an anchor point for like my tear damage, but we'll see that a little bit more in a little bit. But you can see I just kind of painted, and I have it 2 layers, which is going to be really important in a second. But we'll worry about that in a second, like I said. Here's the paper residue. We'll come back to this because, yeah, let's go ahead and just start from here. So this is a little bit confusing, but because I kind of did this gradually or procedurally. The first thing I did was I went ahead and just worked with my sticker shape, right? I didn't worry about that tear yet. I kind of just worked with the sticker shape first. So then what I did was I went ahead and used that as a mask for where I wanted the sticker to be. And I just set its material to have normal, roughness, and color. So the color, I just loaded in an image. So I just brought in this texture map that's kind of hard to see, but if we look at it in base color, it looks like that. The color, it was like way too much and way too bright. You can see that's glowing. So I just added a color correct node on this layer. I just kind of brought down the values in both the shadows and the highlights and brought the saturation, shift the hue a little bit. And so that was that layer. I added a bit of a contact shadow. So you can see I added just this really, really, really subtle contact shadow so I can make it feel a little bit like it has a little extra dimension to it. I added some height to it, right? So that just lifts the surface up and it can catch light differently on those edges, right? You can see those edges start to catch light a little bit and cast shadows like that. You can see I'm also going ahead and setting the, we come over here to the heights. Again, I'm setting it to normal and not linear dodge add, because if I do linear dodge add, it kind of brings the information from the leather below up. I want it to feel like it's on top. So I just set that to normal. So it overrides the layer below. Cool. All right. And then we got this like kind of bumpy surface. So I gave it kind of like this vinyl. I was noticing a lot of the stickers had like this kind of bumpy vinyl kind of surface texture to it. I also added a fold. So this fold is literally just, that's the bumpy. Let's take a look at the fold. The fold is literally, I got this kind of like long vein shape here, right? I went ahead and warped it to distort it, blurred it a little bit. I made sure I clamped it off so it didn't affect the leather. It's only affecting the sticker. And then I went ahead and grabbed this as an anchor point so I can use it up here for the sharp shape. And then I kind of created these like sharper creases in here too. So I went ahead and on this one's a little weird, but I'll show you. So I made sure I brought in that same shape from down below. I also screened on this other pattern right here, just to kind of give some other ones as well. I went ahead and cut them out, so made sure they're only affecting sticker. I use the levels node so that I can kind of get shrink and get these higher contrast shapes. Then I kind of distorted them a little bit. And then I use this high pass filter. So we'll first look at this. You can see as I build these up over time, right? So here's that referenced anchor point. And then what I'm doing is I'm adding in this other one, making sure it's only affecting the sticker. We're using levels to kind of shrink that shape in a little bit. So you can see it's still adding on to the wrinkle below it. Then when I warp it a little bit, and then we have this high pass filter. So high pass filter is really just an edge detection filter. And so the way it's working with this is that it's kind of creating the emphasis or the detail or the information along the edges instead of just pushing this whole middle surface up. It's pushing up and down the edges instead, which works pretty great for like paper wrinkles. I have a levels node here. You can see I'm not really doing anything with it. I had it here originally to like adjust these values, but I was adjusting these values out here, right? I was kind of playing around with them and seeing what I liked, right? So maybe something like that. I don't know. But anyways, so I was goofing around with that a little bit, and so that's just going to add a little bit of extra wrinkles in there. I wanted wherever it was wrinkled in a sharp crease, I also kind of wanted the paper to be torn, like the color on top to be missing. So what I did was, oh, you can see that levels node is going to cause me problems. Oh wait, no, it wasn't the levels node. It was just I didn't have that anchor point. Okay, there we go. Oh, it is the levels node. Okay, cool. So up here, I went ahead and just pulled in that sharp fold here, and I went ahead and brought it in. I used blur slope to add some texture to it, and then I just used histogram scan, which is essentially a glorified levels node, just to kind of get these smaller spots here where the paper is kind of torn and actually like that top part's torn. Okay. And then I just added a little grunge to it, right, just to break it up and make it look dirty. So that's all I did to this. I mean, you know, it took me a little while to get kind of this setup structure going between the folds and this different information. The next thing I did was I did this paper residue effect. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this tears. Let's go to the sticker base. All right. So the first thing I did was I went ahead and ate away at my sticker. So when you tear a sticker, you can just clearly cut off the sticker, right? Like you just really rip it off. But as you've probably experienced in life, when you try to rip a sticker off of something, a lot of times the top part comes off, but the paper that was glued to the surface stays behind, which is always frustrating. So the first thing I did was I just ate away at it. So I made this like tearing anchor point that's separate. So it's in the shape of that right there. You can see that's just being used to subtract out of and eat away at that map right there. And I was grabbing that as a reference point because all these other heights and bumps and folds and all that stuff have to be referencing that as well. And then underneath it, I wanted to have like a paper residue. So for the paper residue, I have two layers. I have like this layer here, and then I have this layer right there. That edging, I didn't want that to be there, so I probably messed up something in the process of playing around with this to show you guys. But I kind of wanted, actually in this case, I probably only need one of these. Yeah, so we'll just look at this one paper residue. So this paper residue, you can see we have the sticker base, right? And you can see it has a much sharper fall off onto it. And then we have the paper residue, which has like a softer fall off, right? You can see it kind of spreads out here a little bit further. And I also shrink it in a little bit so that the sticker base should come out further than the paper residue. So let's come back out here. I still don't know why that shouldn't be showing up over here. That doesn't matter. Okay, so the way this one's working is I went ahead and for the paper residue, I made sure I got that first shape. I went ahead and blurred it and shrank it in a little bit. And then I went ahead and subtracted out just like this one. I'm essentially doing the same thing on this one, but I'm using a different anchor point here. So this anchor point that I'm subtracting out is the soft mask, and the one that I'm subtracting out of this one is just the normal mask. So I come over here, down here, I have this, this paint layer, right? So this is where I'm painting my tear mark. I'm just using a brush, and then I make an anchor point. And then I use a levels node to get like a sharper crunch. And then that's what this tear mark right here is. So we have a soft one and a hard one. And this right here, it'll maybe look like this when I do this levels node, it's overriding this one, but it's not, because this is anchoring, this anchor point's referencing everything in this layer down below itself. So all this information here. So it's not, it doesn't reference this information up here. And then this one's referencing everything down here, right? So it's also getting that information down here and doing that levels clamp. So that's how I'm having two different kind of same paint map, but two different shapes kind of spreading and shrinking, right? And if I come up here, if I go ahead and use that levels node, right, I can kind of play around with where that tear starts and stops on the main base. I can also come here and play around with oh, this is for the edge, right? Let's bring that in a little bit. And I think I could probably play with it on this fill node, right? I can kind of shrink and pull a little bit of that residue there. And if I wanted to modify the residue shape and kind of add to it or subtract it, I could just come over here, and usually I'll have a node that I call like paint me. So I know if I ever want to play around with it and modify it, I can do that. So I'm just going to come over here, let's enable it so I can actually paint on it. So let's go ahead and we're going to, oops, I'm going to go ahead and eat away at this. And you can see this is, let's make this a lot more extreme. And let's go ahead, in this case, I needed something a little bit sharper here. So let's go ahead and I'm going to get like something, maybe like this one. And we're going to bring this to a low size. And so you can see I can, and let's pull it up and let us use a little bit of flow. So you can see right there, right, as I'm tearing through. If I did this on a very large scale with flow, low, and build it up, you can see as I go over the same area multiple times, right, first when I do this area, right, it takes off that first part, right, and that's because of this levels node right here that is taking that information there, and it's really making it high contrast. So that's being used on the sticker base right here. But on the residue, you can see it's not erasing that information quite as fast. So the residue information stays behind longer until I start, you know, kind of painting more over that area until it can no longer do that. And of course, you know, there's going to be like little ghosts, which isn't great. So if I wanted to like kind of make it sharp in one area, like a really sharp, clean cut right there, I might do something like that. And then let some areas be a little soft right there. So that's how we've done this kind of sticker residue effect, right? And I do this with like peeling paint and rust and anything else where we have this two-tiered, we're using the same painting information here. I'm painting the same like map or pattern. And then I'm actually getting like a soft version of it, right? So the normal version of it with some gray values to it. And then I use a levels node to clamp it and then make another mask, which is what's being used to help create these different spreads of that pattern, right? And it's based off of this levels map right here. Cool. So that's basically the sticker. It's a lot of details, but hopefully that helps. And the last feature, I didn't include this, but this one's, if you can understand the embossing and sticker stuff, this should be pretty easy. But I also just added these like kind of pin marks or Sharpie marks, right? I didn't really use this mostly because I didn't really find a good reason to use it. But for the most part, this one is just using a color. That color is set to multiply, so it's going to darken. I've set the roughness to be a little bit glossier, right? Pen ink, you know, it's going to be pretty glossy. So it's kind of filling in these areas and making the surface a little bit less rough. And so I just kind of set this glossiness so it hits differently. And then I just had a paint layer where I was just painting on those marks. So you could do that. You can write your name, but make it really kind of rough. So if I wrote, let's see, let's come in here and let's get that flow up. So if I wrote Caleb, right? So I could do that. And then if I needed to make that look a little bit more organic, I might add like a fill layer. We're going to set this to multiply, or subtract, either one. And then I might do something like I might add in like a texture to break it up a bit. So let's just add in the texture to break it up a bit, increase that contrast, bring the balance down a little bit, something like that maybe. And then I could do something like I could do a filter blur. Let's do a filter blur. And then we're going to do a levels node to sharpen again. So for the blur, we're going to go ahead and blur it up. Let's get rid of that directional noise for a second, and then we can use that levels node to clamp back down, which can kind of soften our shapes a little bit if we're using a mouse and our shapes are getting too perfect or something like that. And let's just go ahead and bring this down a little bit. Cool. So just showing you how you could do something like that. I wouldn't raise the surface at all, right? Because ink is very flat. Okay, let's move on to the canvas. I'm going to go ahead and go through this pretty quickly. This one's not quite as complicated. There are parts that are a little bit complicated, but I don't want to dive into it too much. But here's kind of the basic setup, right? I have a lot of wear information up here. So this is all just information that's adding extra wear and damage and color information. So I'm just going to turn those off for now. I have this little leather patch that I'm just actually referencing this layer here and then doing some tricks to make it feel a little bit more like it's kind of on the surface. But let's go ahead and start with the base fabric. So let's go ahead and look at this base fabric. So I actually started from this flannel tartan. And again, shout out to Jeff Nichols for kind of inspiring and giving me a lot of this information that I'm kind of building off of here. It's, kind of motivated by watching his stuff and learning from him. So if you guys haven't, check out his stuff. He has obviously amazing information on his YouTube channel and his classes on how to approach texturing these things. He makes it really easy. So I just kind of brought in this leather tartan material. So if I go over here, I typed in, or flannel. Those are my smart materials. Yeah, there he is. Fabric flannel tartan. Sorry, tartan, whatever that is. So I brought it over. It had this folder with all this interesting information in it. And then I essentially went ahead and kind of dialed these on one at a time, used the parts I liked, and then added new parts that I felt like I needed. So we'll bring these down. So first thing I did was I brought this this here, and I went ahead and it has this like noise on it to kind of break up the surface a bit, the color, and I just set a base color to it, right? And it has a little bit of height to it, a little bit of roughness, and it's just setting all of our base material patterns or attributes, right? So it gives me this really soft, rough, with a little bit of like color breakup in it so that it has some texture to it. Then we have this surface detail, right, which is loading in this checker map, right? So this checker map is essentially just like a tiled checker, right? And you can see it's tiling a lot. You have this pattern here that's being tiled multiple times as well. And so if we took a look at this, it should look kind of like that. And it's basically just affecting height for the most part. Yeah, so it's just affecting height, and that's just giving a little bit of an edge or depth or hardness to that. The flannel material had these kind of flannel patterns that came from a demo or base material from before. I just turned those off because that wasn't what I was needing, and honestly I should delete them just so my file's a little bit lighter. We got this kind of pilling effect, which I mostly kept intact. But this is kind of just adding, again, height. So you can see it's adding a lot of height, right? And then it's also adding a lighter color. So it's like kind of adding this slightly lighter color. If we go to base color, it just shows like a lighter color than the base one. And then it's just getting this kind of purlin noise and clouds to break it up. So we get these little dots and specks. Okay. And then what we did is we got this kind of fiber wear. So again, you're getting a lot of this speckly pattern here. And this is doing a lot of the same thing that the layer below it did before, but it's kind of grabbing these areas where it kind of lifted and roughed it up a bit more. So that surface kind of feels again like, you kind of braided it, and that surface or the threading kind of starts to pull out, which gives you this kind of like lumpy kind of effect, right? So again, this is doing height and color. In this case, the color is adding to the layer below, a lot like screens, so it gives it a lighter color. Okay. We got this kind of top-down discoloration, right? So this is going to be a lot like the top-down on this one right here. Oops, not that one. It's using, in this case, is using a light node, which is a lot like the world space normals. Well, it is using world space normals, but the light fill load node, which is essentially just going to do this top-down light, and then warping it so it kind of picks up a little bit of a texture pattern and it isn't just perfect, right? Okay. Then we added in this edge darkening effect, and I continue this up here a little bit more, where we get a little bit more edge darkening. We're just going to add that in, so that's just going to make some of these, if we look at color, you can see, okay, thank you. You can see it's getting these like darker edges in here. That one's just using, in this case, it's using a UV border detection, which is grabbing a mask based on the UV tiles. So it was grabbing these edges of where these UV tiles are cut. So it creates this mask. And then it just has this warp and clouds node to break it up. Cool. And then we have this threading disruption here. So this is going to be, again, adding kind of like the pilling effect, but it's going to be adding a lot like the orange stuff up here that I did. This kind of breakup or almost feels like a thread's being pulled off of the surface a bit. Okay. Then I kind of brought this in where I have two fold nodes, right? So a lot like the fold up here. This is just like using a, here's what the map is. Oof. Fold extra. Let's see. So it's got that crystal pattern, which is going to be like a foldy pattern. And then I blurred it a little bit. You can see without that blur, it's too hard. And then I just use this warp to kind of distort and warp it. I don't know why it's doing like a warp projection. I guess maybe I did a warp projection on it. Oh, planar projection. Okay. And then we have this primary fold here. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one. So the primary folds is hopefully going to do something. I guess it's not. What's going on? So this should be large scale folds, and I do reference this in the color, so we get this. Oh, okay. So this is one of those layers where I just don't have anything on, a lot like a paint layer, because I just wanted to use this as a mask, right? I'm going to be referencing this. So I kind of created this, I grabbed this fold cloth material, did UV projection, I used a Perlin noise to kind of lose and find it a little bit, and then I anchor pointed it. And then up here on this displacement node, I just grabbed that anchor point, right? You can see this is grabbing that anchor point down here. I just use the levels node to kind of control those shapes of that displacement. So if we bring this up, let's see what's on the displacement. So I'm just doing a little bit of height. So we'll come up here, turn that on. So it's very subtle, but there's a little bit of height rupturing kind of going on here. But it's much more noticeable when we turn on this color effect. So, ooh, come on. Sorry, this is taking a little bit for it to load. Right, so when I was looking at a lot of my references, let's go in here. I think I should have some of them here. Ooh. Hopefully we got... Oh, okay. I don't have very many. Let me go ahead and pause and find some. Here we go. So much like with the leather, you can see where there's been creases that it kind of picks up a lighter color. And so that's what's happening with a lot of these folds. And maybe even just like, again, kind of like leather, something scratches it or goes across it, which gives it this like lighter tone. So that's what I was trying to get here. So I got this kind of big primary shape. You can see this is just like, again, an anchor point layer. This is just for extra detail and wrinkling, and this is really enhancing those, what I anchor pointed here is in that colored node. All right, then I added some more kind of ambient occlusion darkening value effects. So let's go ahead and turn this to base color so we can kind of see that cavity dark. All right, so it's just using ambient occlusion. Doing that again with another one, but using a little bit bigger shapes and using like a cooler color. Just turn both of those on and off, right? So you see it adds a little bit of depth to it. Again, I'm adding another layer of like top-down color and desat. So whether it's dust or it's sun bleaching, right? We can see that right here, right there. And then I kind of made a custom one. I just duplicated this layer and I just painted where I wanted the effect. So I found areas where, like right here where I felt like maybe it would have gotten bumped and scratched. And so we get a little bit of that lightning wear here. And same thing with this area. Maybe this part of this, this pouch would be scratching or rubbing against things frequently. Okay, so that's my fabric. So let's move on to the next part. Okay, so I added this leather patch. So this leather patch is essentially, I kind of wanted to create that. Some of those had like a, part of it had like a patch on it, I don't know, just for aesthetic reasons. And so for this one, I went ahead and, let's call this one CC for color correction. I follow Jeff's techniques. So if you see that and it looks familiar, it's because Jeff does it. All right, so let's turn these off. So in this case, I did a, oh, and the stitches. Where are those stitches at? Oh, it should not be showing up. Hmm. Stitches. Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. All right, so in this case, I'm just doing an instance. I came over to my leather, and what I did was in my layer stack, I just grabbed my leather right here. I didn't want the embossing sticker and all that stuff. I just right-clicked it and said instantiate across texture sets and chose my canvas. So what that does is it essentially, like an anchor point, it references that entire material that I had or layer folder that I had selected, and it brought it in as essentially like a material layer. And then if I didn't have that mask on, right, if I just disabled that, let's go in here. Oops. Just add a fill layer. If we added a fill layer and set this to white, you can see the whole thing just becomes like my leather material stuff up here. So that's what came in first. So I just kind of used painting with like a polygon selection to grab like a square down here. So this one right here, I did this to grab that area down there using poly selection, and then I just cleaned it up with a line. Broke up the edge a little bit just to wobble it, and then again make an anchor point so I can reference it later. I did a lot of the same treatment up here. I did that frizz edge and that frizz detail type stuff. So we did that frizz edge, much like we did up here. I went ahead and just, in this case, I grabbed this mask from down here. I used the mask outline filter to kind of just grab the edge right there. I used warp again to break it up. I used levels to clamp it, and then I subtracted out the mask, right? So I just use this. It's just this one right here, and I'm just multiplying it so that it doesn't spill out onto the canvas. It's just kind of creeping in, and then I of course made an anchor point. So we'll come out here to material, right? As I turn those on, right? So here's what this layer is doing. I went ahead and did mask outline. Warped it and broke it up a little bit, used levels to clamp it, and then I didn't want it on the canvas, so I just subtracted out the original mask. Cool. That just has a height and color and roughness to it. And I added a little bit of detail to it, just a little bit of grit. You know, I could add more, but I did it very much like I did up here. I went ahead and added like this kind of distinction or this raised edge, right? Because I felt like it just needed a little bit, because I didn't have the actual physical geometry like I have up here, like a turning edge. I'm like faking it down here with height. I kind of want to just like enhance that a bit. Then I went ahead and did some custom damage on this area down here, because I'm not, or I do have that tileable damage from up here, but I don't have the hero damage up there. So I added some specific damage for this layer down here. So I just kind of scuffed up these areas where I feel like it would be hitting the edges a bit more. It says bottom light, but in this case, I just kind of darkened and dirtied the bottom, right? So you can see it just gets a little bit of color darkness there. Okay. Overall, when I zoomed out, it felt really kind of like light compared to this one up here. So I just kind of darkened it a bit. Oh, right, I was adding some darker values in there. And when I did my color correction, I just kind of darkened and saturated a little bit to better match this area up here. So that's, again, just a pass-through paint node with nothing in it, just a pass-through layer, so I could add filters on it to affect all the colors and roughness below. So I just did a roughness adjustment to, you know, make it a little glossier in some areas, and then color correction to darken that material. Cool. Then I added a stitches layer. So this one, I'm really not going to go into this one too much, but in this case, what I did was in this case, you know, you don't see anything. Again, I can turn the color back on so we can see it here. I created a paint layer, but in this time, what I did was I used the new curve tool. And so in this curve tool, I just, if we select that curve tool, and we go ahead and click on this right here, we can see this is the curve I drew out, right? I drew out a curve in that direction. And on this curve, once I did that, I can, with that curve selected, I can come down here and then I can attach a brush shape. So in this case, I just found Stitch Generator, which is just like in here. I think it's called Stitch Generator right here. And I attached it as the alpha. You can change what its shape is and what it looks like. But overall, I just made sure this was affecting height, color, and roughness. But as you'll see, I turned off all those. I just dialed them down to 0 because I was just going to reference this anyways. I just adjusted the spacing, right? If I want to go ahead and look at what that looks like, let's turn that off. right? So I'm just adjusting the spacing if I want wider, slower spacing. If I want to change the size of the stitches, I can do that. Maybe let's make them a little bit bigger. And yeah, so, but like I said, that information's in there, and I added anchor point to reference this. Let's call this Stiches anchor. So you can see I'm using it in a height and shadow layer. But anyways, so what I did here, let's go ahead and turn the color off. And so I went ahead and added a height layer. So we added that right here. So again, I'm just referencing the stitches, right? We're just grabbing that stitches layer. And then I just use the levels node to kind of shrink it, right? I didn't want the whole stitch to pop out. It gives it a bit of a rounder shape. If I didn't do that, it would look a little bit more like this. Oh, there we go. Okay, whatever. I had to contract it a little bit. Oh, it's probably because of these guys right here. So let's go ahead, and if I bring that up, right, it kind of has this really soft look to it, so I had to clamp it down so we get a sharper shape here. I use the levels node to kind of make it a little bit crisper. I use a little bit of a blur directional node. So this blur directional node is just going to kind of blur it this way, right? So without blur directional, they kind of have this shape. I did that so it gives this like kind of hill effect, which was nice. And then I kind of shrank it down with the levels node. So it's just height, a little bit of roughness. I got my color node, right? So the color node is actually referencing the, yeah, Stiches shape. So it's still, well, that's weird. So it's grabbing that Stiches shape node. I'm not sure why it's grabbing it from there. And then again, just doing like a little breakup. So the color isn't constant, right? It just has a little bit of value differentiation. This cast shadow shape right here is meant to kind of like push down on the surface a bit and also add a little shadow, so it kind of feels like it's pulling down a bit. So that's really just grabbing the stitches, right? So you can see it's grabbing the stitches, and I'm just doing like, again, just like beveling, blurring, warping, blurring, just to kind of get like this kind of line underneath them. And I'm doing the same thing on this one right here too. And this one, it's going to have a much sharper cast shadow shape, hopefully. Let's see. Please? Yeah, okay, you can see it's very subtle. But if I take a look at this, right, I was doing this almost literally like a little cast shadow shape underneath them. And maybe I can push the height in a little bit more if I want it to punch in more. But yeah, that starts to look a little weird. Cool. So that's mostly what the stitches are. There are other, like, there's actually like stitch material brushes that you can like draw it across, but because it didn't work with the curve tool, and I really wanted to play with the curve tool. All right, so that's all the leather patch. All right, so let's get to the end stretch. So the last stretch here is I essentially did on the canvas a little cast shadow, a lot like I did on my sticker, right? So that's just going to be just creating a bit of a contact shadow to help make it maybe feel like it pops a bit. I added an overall color grad so that the whole this whole down area back down here is de-emphasized, and I'm looking more up here. I added a hero staining to it, right? So on the stain, all I did was I just brought in this kind of shape, dropped it on there, used blur slope to break it up, and then I used checker to kind of grab the same kind of pattern as my denim, and I'm just subtracting it out. If I did it all the way up to here, you can see it looks like that. But that way I get a little bit of information that's corresponding to the surface of my canvas, because otherwise it would just kind of sit on top, right? You know, it just sits on top. So I'll just do that, but maybe not subtract it quite that much. Cool. And I just gave it its own height, color, and normal, or sorry, height, color, and roughness. I added this other stain over here, and I can, you know, go more information around here, but again, this is kind of representing different moments in time, right? Like we have these general wear features that kind of build up over multiple instances, but then a lot of these stains are like specific moments in time. Like this was mustard, you know, from a hot dog, right? This is paint, you know, some oil paint that dried on, right? So those are very specific moments in time, much like these kind of Sharpie marks in that sticker. Okay, so this one is doing very much the same thing. And then the very last one is I kind of added this like kind of speckly drips pattern, which in this case, let's go ahead and drop the color a bit. Oh, wait, not that one. Just drop the color just a bit, right? So that's just, and I could add in another one, right? It's just like overall dirt and grossness that builds up over time. And I have it on you know, all parts, the leather, canvas down here, and I can do the same thing up here. Cool. So thanks for sticking with me through that. That's pretty much the entire approach I had here. Again, I want to shout out Jeff Nichols, where a lot of this material was stuff that I was building off of and studying from his, and kind of took a lot of inspiration, but kind of wanted to do it myself and show some other features that I thought was kind of neat that I learned from other areas too. So hope that helps.